I think at the same time we can think that science is extremely powerful. It really is. I mean, look at what it's achieved and look at what it continues to achieve and may achieve in the future. It's just phenomenal. Excessive belief would be where, I mean, it's best just to go with examples. It's where someone dogmatically assumes that anyone who holds a religious belief is an idiot because science could show you that God doesn't exist.
Right.
I mean, that's not the kind of thing science can even do in principle, right? Science could really give you outstanding reasons to question whether God could exist, but prove whether God doesn't exist. How could it do that, right? That science could show us how we ought to act morally in the world. And then if we go to applications just day to day, that if you're studying non-scientific subjects at school or university, you're wasting your time. Some people hold that view, right? You get some very pushy parents, for example, who insist that their children only study the sciences, right? And because otherwise, why would you study like history or philosophy or art or music? What a waste of time! Like, why would you do that? That's the kind of thing I have in mind by scientism. Pernicious manifestations of an excessive belief in the power or value of science, which has negative consequences for the place of non-scientific subjects or areas of culture in the world, and has real-world effects when we see, for example, funding just plummet for the arts, or the number of students studying the arts at school, university just go down year on year.
All right, my name is Dr. Matthew Aiello, and welcome to Researching Happy. This is the podcast all about the stories behind the studies of the happiness and wellbeing research world. So this is episode 20, a mini milestone. And I'm really happy with the progress so far. It's been an honor to chat with so many respected researchers and people related to the world of happiness and wellbeing. All of whom are doing amazing things in the world. Thanks for all the support for the show so far, the feedback, the ideas. As I've asked, I guess, every episode, please just keep it coming. So today we have Dr. Jonathan Beale, or Dr. John, as we can't figure out what to call him, is a researcher, a coach, and an educator whose research focuses on human flourishing, particularly in the workplace and in education, and the science of learning. He's a research affiliate at the Human Flourishing Program at Harvard University, a peak performance coach at the Flow Research Collective, and the co-host of Flourish FM, a podcast for the good life. I recommend listening. He's previously held research posts at the University of Oxford and Eton College, and he's a co-editor of 4 books, including The Future of Education, forthcoming from Oxford University Press, and published 30 research articles and book chapters in leading academic journals, book publishers, and media outlets, including the New York Times. So if anyone watched the very first episode, or almost like the pre-episode of this podcast, I said that I wanted to learn about this issue of scientism, which, as you've just heard, is defined by Jonathan as the pernicious manifestations of an excessive belief in the power of science. And I was reading a book last night by Seraphim Rose, and just happened to come across this passage last night. He's talking about like the source of truth in the world, and he says this is from the book Nihilism. The unreflective scientific specialist sees no need for any other kind of knowledge. Occupied with the demands of his or her specialty, and has perhaps neither time nor inclination for abstract questions to inquire, for example, the basic presuppositions of that specialty. So I thought that was actually a really nice little paragraph, I guess, to sort of capture some of the issues that can come from scientism. And you hear, basically it's the topic of this whole conversation. As we discussed, the issue of scientism can affect wellbeing research, of course, particularly as it's a field that has so much input from alternative ways of knowing than just the scientific method. So Jonathan has done obviously so much more work than his focus on scientism. I'm sure he was prepared to talk about all of those other things as well, but I really just hammered him on this idea of scientism. I wanted to make sure that I really understood it. And so we did also focus on the rest of his work as well, or at least some of it. We chat about this idea of the future of education, coaching, and wellbeing research. So I hope you enjoy the episode. You can support the podcast on locals.com. Support starts at $5 a month, and thanks to those who have been supporting the show so far. And you can stay in touch with us on LinkedIn, on Twitter, on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. And if you would like to help out in a small way, subscribing and giving the show a rating on any of those platforms really makes a huge difference. One of the things that we've been trying to do is sort of build a bit of a community around the show. And so I'm thinking of doing another catch-up that we've done one already in the past with listeners. So hoping to put that out. I'll put some stuff on social media, but maybe one like mid-September. So I'll put some dates out. And if anyone's really keen on this, which is like just a Zoom where we just chat, not record or anything like that, let me know. Just get in contact with me. I think LinkedIn is the best place to do that. I'd love to see you there. So enjoy the episode and welcome Dr. Jonathan Beale.
Johnny's what my mates call me. I don't know. I mean, I'm trying to like get better at cultivating a sort of online podcast identity because I do a lot of these now. I wasn't expecting to be doing all these podcast interviews, but I do like one every 2 months probably now.
Really?
A lot of them. Yeah, I'm flattered that anyone wants to speak to me. But like I'm trying to like get better at this whole, I don't know, public intellectual thing. And so I'm torn about names actually. Like on social media, you can find me as Dr. Jonathan Beale or Johnny Beale. You can't find me as John Beale. So I don't know. What should I call myself here?
I don't know.
I noticed you just got Matt. So it's pretty informal. I'll just go Matt and Johnny if you want.
Yeah, that's fine. Look, I think the names disappear anyway, but that raises like we can kick off from this point basically. Like I don't really know how to start these things anyway, but I love that as a place to start. You know, the tagline of the show is stories behind the studies, and so that is part of the story, I guess, behind these researchers is how do you cultivate yourself online? Do you know, because I'm guessing most of your life you were a person called Johnny, and then you're eventually Dr. Jonathan or Dr. Beale, I guess. So that's interesting.
Yeah. I mean, on the name thing, I have an odd relationship with my name in that when I was at school, high school, which is school actually, all schools, up until the age of 18, I guess I didn't really even have a first name in the sense that all my mates at school called me Beale.
Okay.
You know, like you do, like you have mates at school that you just call by their last name, like
sure.
Smith, Jones, whatever it is, or Smithy or Jonesy, and I was just Beale. Of course, my parents called me John or Jonathan if I was getting told off, and my sister called me John. But literally all my friends called me Beale. I suppose teachers even sometimes call me Beale. They're like, "Oh, hey, Beale, get on with your work." So like that. So when I took a year out, or as they often call it now, a gap year in the UK, and travelled and went to your fine country, Australia, for much of it, I kind of, okay, what name shall I go with? And it was Jonathan, John, Johnny. I don't know what other variations you can have with the name Jonathan.
Jono, that would go in Australia.
Oh, Jono. Yeah, it would, but I can't pull off Jono, I don't think. I want to pull off Jono. So I went with Johnny. And that stuck, and I went with that throughout uni. And why don't I often go by that name now? The reason I don't go by that name now is I think to pull off the name Johnny, you either need to be a rock star, a teenager, or like a very posh Englishman that can pull it off. Hello, Johnny. And I'm none of those things. So sadly I'm not a rock star, and sadly I'm no longer a teenager. So, and I'm not a posh Englishman, even though I might sound like one sometimes. So my mates still call me that, but I guess in academic circles and like writing and as a podcaster and whatever else I'm doing, it seems more taken more seriously if I use the name John or Jonathan.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to ask. It's almost there is this tendency to want to put the most formal, serious version of yourself out there because you're a serious academic, but that leaves no room for, I guess, your sort of personality to come through when it's like that.
Yeah, and that's something I'm learning about the whole podcast world, actually. It's really interesting, the podcast world. I mean, I'd love to hear what you think about this. But so I've been advised, actually, when I've done certain podcast interviews, or when someone's invited me to be on a podcast ahead of the podcast, for some of them, when they've discussed the kind of things they want to discuss on there, it's been questions that are very personal, letting the personal side of you come out, your personal story. And not just podcasting either. Like I was speaking to some friends about friends and sort of social media management people about the best way to use social media, because I think I'm pretty rubbish at using social media, to be honest. I need to sort of get good at doing that. And they've said it's about, building your personal brand, your personal life. And yet I work in a world where you're trying to avoid reporting anecdotes and trying to report objective research and what the research says, and you're kind of pulled out of the picture. So I am finding it hard to try and figure out what is the best way to be a podcaster, to be a podcast guest, to present yourself on social media when you're a researcher, but also kind of trying to speak to a general audience more. Because I love writing for a general audience, right? And doing more of that. And if you're on a podcast, a guest, if you're trying to let that shine through as well, what's the right balance there? And I certainly haven't mastered it. Have you found this, doing a podcast and being on podcasts?
Look, I know exactly what you're talking about. I think my tendency is to ignore all of that advice, because I think if you're being authentic, which is what I'm trying to do, then like building or cultivating a personal brand should just come naturally. It's kind of it's the natural result of authenticity, which is completely what I get from you. I listened to a couple of episodes of your fine podcast, Flourish FM. No worries. And it's that's what comes through basically. It's not, it's authentic. That's how it comes through to me. So, no issues there. So the topic of, I guess, what to call you is almost the theme of what I want to go to in this conversation, because I kind of have you pegged. So this is, hopefully don't take this the wrong way. You're more than what I'm about to say, but this is how I have understood your work to date, is almost this Venn diagram of, there's three circles. There's a scientism circle, there's an education circle, and then there's a flourishing circle. And in the middle there is Beale, Johnny, not Jono, Jonathan.
Jono, maybe that'll be a new turn after today. That's pretty accurate to some degree. There's a few other circles we could add in there, but yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. No, exactly. I'm sure there are. But so I would love to sort of hear, to begin with, so I was just explaining to you before we started, I was really interested in this idea of scientism. It's kind of when I did like episode 0, I kind of said, what are the things I want to get into? Obviously, a lot of it is the sort of hearing and sharing the life of a researcher, hearing what happens from probably a lot of unhappy happiness researchers. But then knowing what it's like to live in this world, but some of the major criticisms as well. That's what I wanted to sort of learn more about, the criticisms of this research world. And one that I was personally very interested in was scientism. And you reminded me actually that it was Erie Mountbatten O'Malley that introduced me to your work. And I was just so excited that someone has started, not started this, but written a book about this recently, a whole book on the topic that I want to know most about. So it would be amazing if we could sort of hear about what drew you to scientism, what it is for the people who haven't heard of it, and what are some of the major issues that it can cause.
Yeah, sure. So what drew me to it was, so I did a PhD in philosophy, and I was writing on the philosophy of Ludwig Wittgenstein and Martin Heidegger, and there's a lot of interest in the philosophy of those two philosophers, and also shared concerns they have. They're working from very different traditions, yet they're living at the same time. It's early to mid 20th century philosophy, and they're also huge figures in philosophy, and they have been very influential in 20th century philosophy and philosophy since. Less so nowadays than then, but there's a lot of interest in their shared thoughts and one or shared kind of concerns in philosophy, and one of them is with what's wrong with a certain attitude towards philosophical explanations and philosophical questions in terms of how you might address them as a kind of scientific question or a sort of pseudo-scientific question. And that's where this concept of scientism comes up. So I'll come on to what that is in a moment. But that's kind of how I started working on it. And I got fascinated by it. And I thought that, I was troubled by some ways in which philosophical problems, traditions, debates were being approached. And I thought that maybe the root cause of my misgivings lay in what we could call scientism. So scientism you could define as excessive belief in the power or value of science. And that's certainly not to be confused with being anti-scientific. I'm definitely not anti-scientific. I'm very scientific in the way I think about things. But there's a difference between being anti-scientific and being scientistic. So excessive belief in the power or value of science would be to, for example, dogmatically assume that any meaningful question is a scientific question. There is no such thing as a meaningful question that isn't a scientific question. Or that all knowledge that can legitimately be called a form of knowledge is scientific in kind. Or that scientific methods have unlimited application in any domain and can exhaust the explanations of any particular subject area. And you'd have to dogmatically assume this, because you could give a reasonably good argument as to why you could apply natural scientific methods in any subject. It's more just the assumption that other forms of inquiry, other subjects are just meaningless or could be engulfed by science. That's the kind of attitude we describe as scientistic.
Yeah. So would you go, so when you're sort of saying it's the excessive belief in science, do you mean specifically the scientific method itself?
Yeah, good question. So what would then count as science? Typically, scientism is associated with the natural sciences.
Okay.
So biology, chemistry, physics in particular, and typically with kind of very radical reductionist assumptions that you could reduce, let's say, some area of the humanities. So what's going on when people do philosophy, when philosophers do philosophy, let's say, or engaging in philosophical questions, philosophical discussions, but also what's going on in, say, historical investigations and so on, when people are engaged in history. And you could ultimately reduce that kind of explanation, analysis, conceptual repertoire, anything going on there to an analysis in terms of the natural sciences, and you could keep going more and more fundamental until ultimately you get to an explanation purely in terms of physics, maybe even purely in terms of mathematics, even more fundamentally than that. It would be hard to identify scientism with, say, a science that sits way above, as it were, the natural sciences, given the history of the concept that it's typically goes back to the great success the natural sciences had in explaining the world, and then the belief that, okay, well, the sciences have been so successful, maybe we could extrapolate those processes to other subjects, other domains, other areas of human inquiry with similar results. Yeah. So as it were, it stems from the natural sciences. But you could say there are forms of scientism that involve something much more loose than that. So, for example, the tendency to use scientific language and be taken much more seriously because you're doing that, perhaps even to win an argument if you're doing that. Yeah. How often do people think about like going to a talk or watching a lecture or watching a TED talk or reading a newspaper or something, and someone starts talking about the prefrontal cortex, right? Or the vagus nerve, or just starts talking about, C fibers firing in the brain, or anything neuroscientific, the amygdala, or dopamine, or serotonin, and everyone's like, totally get it now, totally won over by it now. Even though maybe a lot of people, including the speaker giving the talk, doesn't really know much about these things. Yeah. But it's like, that makes perfect sense. Why? Because it's neuroscience. It's got to be true.
Kind of like science washing an argument. I don't know if that's such a term.
It's very powerful these can be very powerful concepts, terms, pieces of language to use. And of course, if you use them in legitimate ways and the person using these terms knows what they're talking about and can express them in a conceptual repertoire, let's say the conceptual repertoire of neuroscience and perhaps also psychology, within a well-versed argument or explanation of something, and the audience, it's made clear to the audience what's going on. But sometimes these are sort of just wheeled in to win an argument, to sound impressive, to make someone sound intelligent. And it's not just with scientific terms. You get it in other areas too. You get it in economics or in finance, when people start using fancy terms that no one understands. To be used, in dangerous ways sometimes, to make people think, well, I can't really engage in the kind of high-level financial analysis this person is engaging in, so I'll just sort of steer clear of this, like quantitative easing or something like that, right? The point being that if you use concepts or language to try and make something sound more impressive or make yourself sound more impressive, and you do succeed in that endeavor, then that could be argued to be a form of scientism, in the sense that something's taken more seriously simply through the use of language associated with the sciences in such a way that you maybe couldn't do that with, say, language or concepts associated with maybe philosophy or theology.
Yeah, okay. Great, thank you. And I'm wondering if Jonathan is the scientism version of Jono. Using your scientific version of your name. Anyway, that was stupid. What did you, so in your early work, did you use and is there a classic example of scientism, gone wrong or something like that?
Well, yeah, so I define it as excessive belief in the power or value of science, because I don't think you can capture all forms of scientism just in terms of excessive belief in the power of science. But some do define scientism in this way. One way in which scientism has been defined historically is as a synonym with something called scientific expansionism, which is the idea that you can expand the sciences such that they could eventually engulf what's maybe now, or what has historically been a non-scientific area of inquiry, then becomes an area of science, right? And the most ambitious form of scientism, defined as scientific expansionism, would hold that there is no limit to science. It could keep being expanded until ultimately any form of human explanation or inquiry could be included within the domain of science, within the bounds of science. Now, it's a really legitimate question to ask: what are the limits, if any, of science? And there's a long-standing debate in the philosophy of science about that. But you asked for a classic example. One example would be that science has no limits, that it can just be expanded further and further and further. So Rudolf Carnap, the early 20th century logical empiricist philosopher, famously said that science has no limits. But even because I was trying to find examples of people that held that, science has no limits, and I looked into this, and even Carnap, when he said that science has no limits, he said he still qualified that by writing, this does not mean that there's nothing outside of science, that it's all inclusive. Right. He still thought that the total range of life has still many other dimensions outside of science. There is an example given by, Tom Sorel wrote an excellent book in, I think, 1991, a long time ago, called Scientism, Philosophy and the Infatuation with Science. And what was it? Hang on, maybe it was Mikhail Stenmark that wrote this. Sorry, there's another excellent philosopher on scientism, Mikhail Stenmark. He, as an example of this most radical form of scientific expansionism, quotes Jawaharlal Nehru, the first Prime Minister of independent India, who made his speech, a political speech, said that it's science alone that can solve the problems of hunger and poverty, of insanitation and illiteracy, of superstition and deadening custom and tradition, and so on, and went on to say this. And that, however, is a quote given by a politician, and it was at a national science conference.
Yeah, okay.
It's hyperbolical, right? So I'm not sure how seriously we can take that. It's very hard to find examples of anyone who holds that science has no limits whatsoever. Probably the best examples I've been able to find, so there was a book published a few years ago called Science Unlimited, and in that book, the kinds of examples they gave of what they called in that book science unlimited are those that hold that science can encompass all areas of inquiry, including religion and the supernatural, philosophy and morality. So people who hold that, for example, science can tell us how we ought to act.
Yeah. So they've expanded the definition of science to be so big that it includes the things that actually don't fall within the scientific method.
That's the claim. And the idea would be, though, that science can't right now, let's say, tell us how we should or shouldn't behave morally, but within reason, in principle, a completed science, let's say, science in the future, could provide an objective basis for morality, in the sense that we could derive claims about what we should or ought to do from certain facts about the world. So examples given in that book, Science Unlimited, are of Sam Harris, actually, the super famous neuroscientist, podcaster, and Michael Shermer, a historian of science, I believe. And so Harris has a book called The Moral Landscape, which argues that science can determine values and that we can derive claims about what we should or ought to do from certain facts about the world. That's obviously highly controversial, and it's highly controversial for various reasons in philosophy, but most of all it kind of goes against an influential argument put forward by David Hume, that you can't derive an ought from an is, in the sense that you can't derive normative claims about what we should do about ways the world is, where you can't just deduce an ought claim about how I should live on the basis of facts about the world. You can make a pretty, really good argument about the way we should act, but it's not like you can't just derive that in the sense of extracting a deductive conclusion from these facts about the world.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Perfect. So amazing. So that's a much deeper understanding than I guess I had. So that's very valuable. I'm wondering, when it comes then, I guess the way that I've sort of seen it, and this is a completely uneducated position, I guess, is the idea that scientism, it jumps the issue of bringing value-laden ideas. When we're talking well-being, we're defining, something that is good. And the definition of something that is good comes with, I guess, it's placing a value on that thing, which as I understand the scientific method is designed to avoid value-laden sort of assumptions. So does that factor into that sort of scientism discussion, like the sort of the Hume issue of is versus ought, defining, like you're almost converting something that is, you're then giving it the value judgment of that actually that is a good thing. Is that sort of tied up in that discussion?
I guess so. In some respects, I mean, I think it would be impossible to completely separate evaluative claims from scientific claims, or from what science is, to completely pull them apart, in the sense that I don't think you can just completely separate. We're getting into pretty deep philosophical territory here, I'm aware, but I don't think you can completely just separate kind of descriptive claims about the world from normative claims and get a completely clean separation. So, if we think about what happens in science, it's always intertwined with a variety of normative considerations, such as political considerations. I mean, Oppenheimer is the film of the moment, right, at the cinema now, which is about, in many respects, the ethics of science.
Yep.
What Oppenheimer and his colleagues and peers at the time were doing, what they did, and the huge ethical questions that raises, and still raises to this day. But even if we go to much more small scale pieces of scientific research, it's always intertwined and interlinked with thoughts about how the potential repercussions this could have for life, or not only human beings, but life on Earth. Think about research in AI and the ethics of AI, about what could stand the strongest chance of getting funding in a grant application in the future, about how a person should spend their life if they're choosing to investigate, say, this piece of research rather than something else. All of those are normative questions, normative pursuits. So it's extremely difficult, if not impossible, to think of a purely objective piece of research or research quest where purely objective means you completely separate it from any moral question or ethical question.
Yeah, and I guess just to put it in really concrete terms, if we can use like a worked example quickly, and then we'll move on from scientism. But like if we're thinking of, like, say, the science of longevity, for example, you know, there's an assumption. I guess the if we were to sort of pull apart the did you say the normative and the exploratory, was it, or evaluative? Descriptive. Sorry.
Yeah.
You might say that, you know, the scientific method can tell us what are the factors that predict longevity. But I guess what you're saying is the reason that researchers are even researching longevity in the first place is because there's a normative standard that longevity is a good thing.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great example. And of course, it depends where we set the bar. I mean, we could say that there are no ethical questions raised by this piece of research, right? If the piece of research is like furniture design for using recyclable materials that are affordable for, you know, at least 50% of the population in a middle income country, right? We could say, look, there's no where we mean, of course, there are some ethical questions raised, but you could find some there, but no, if you like, no significant ethical questions raised, right? So you could say, that it depends where we set the threshold. Because if you said there's absolutely no ethical question to be raised, it'd be probably impossible to think of an example of that. But that was the first point I was making in response to your question. Can you completely separate them? No. A descriptive claim about the world, like if you claim Jupiter has 67 moons, the number of moons Jupiter has apparently changes year on year. I listened to an interesting documentary on Jupiter recently, and it used to have 67 moons. I don't know how many it has now, but that's like a descriptive claim, right? A normative claim would be, well, should we go and investigate the Jupiter's moon? Should we fund a satellite to go up there? Right, that's a question about what we ought to do. So whether there are ethical questions raised by some investigative piece of scientific investigation, some area of research, something, if we set the threshold as a significant ethical question, one that really matters, to people, one that has real world repercussions right now, then yes, there are areas of research and investigation, including in science, that don't have significant ethical questions, but there are many that certainly do. And some of the examples I've given, such as what the film Oppenheimer is about, and anything concerning warfare, research into weapons, for example, and AI research right now there's no way you could engage in any kind of, I don't know if you can really engage in any kind of AI research without there being significant ethical questions raised. I don't work in AI research. Maybe you could work on a very low scale piece of AI research, which isn't going to suddenly make AI conscious. But if you're working at high level AI research, then your work is inescapably laden with ethical questions.
And then the scientism comes, like, just to circle back, then the scientism comes from the misapplication or the excessive belief that, say, for example, my AI research can fix the world.
Would that be scientism? Right, so I think the bar should be set pretty high for what counts as scientistic. Okay. I don't think we should be banding that term around too much.
That's useful.
Yeah, so the reason I define it as excessive belief in the power or value of science is because I think that someone can have a very strong belief in the limits or value of science, and there'd be nothing wrong with that, especially if they can give a good argument for it. Science is incredible. Like we really should have the greatest respect for it, as I do. And so I think you can have an extremely high belief in the extraordinary value of science, and there's nothing whatsoever wrong with that. I think at the same time we can think that science is extremely powerful. It really is. I mean, look at what it's achieved, and look at what it continues to achieve and may achieve in the future. It's just phenomenal. Excessive belief would be where I mean, it's best just to go with examples. It's where someone dogmatically assumes that anyone who holds a religious belief is an idiot because science could show you that God doesn't exist.
Right.
I mean, that's not the kind of thing science can even do in principle, right? It could give science could really give you outstanding reasons to question whether God could exist, but prove whether God doesn't exist. How could it do that, right? That science could show us how we ought to act morally in the world. That, and then if we go to applications just day to day, that if you're studying non-scientific subjects at school or university, you're wasting your time. Some people hold that view, right? You get some very pushy parents, for example, who insist that their children only study the sciences, right? And because otherwise, why would you study like history or philosophy or art or music? What a waste of time! Like, why would you do that? That's the kind of thing I have in mind by scientism. Pernicious manifestations of an excessive belief in the power or value of science, which has negative consequences for the place of non-scientific subjects or areas of culture in the world, and has real-world effects when we see, for example, funding just plummet for the arts, or the number of students studying the arts at school, university just go down year on year. One of the reasons for that, I think, is because an influential paradigm, that of scientific explanation and scientific inquiry, is expanded and its value inflated such that non-scientific areas of life are seen as significantly less valuable, perhaps even worthless by comparison.
Perfect. So that's so clear, Jonathan. That's really valuable. So thank you for that. And I think maybe I probably didn't quite get when you say over excessive, you're talking about, it's kind of like, how can you exaggerate the power of science when it's so extremely powerful? So that's a really nice balance and context.
Yeah, and that's why it's such a fascinating concept and question to think about, because it's a very difficult task to try and figure out what limits, if any, science has.
Yeah. Okay.
And
nice.
you also don't want to be you don't want to be someone who goes around trying to tell people you should just stop doing that. There's no point. You're not going to make any progress there. You don't want to be like an anti-progress or anti-scientific progress person, but you do want to try and at least adumbrate some conceptual limitations to things where it has pernicious consequences or may result in people just wasting their time by applying things where they're misapplied.
Great. And so I was really scratching my head about how we go from scientism to education, or how you go from scientism to education. But I think you just laid it out perfectly with that idea of the pushy parents. I think everyone can understand that. Like, get a real job. I'm sure there's a bunch of kids out there who have dropped musical instruments because they were told there's no value in that or whatever. So tell us a little bit about how you've sort of gone from... so the Scientism was your PhD?
Yeah, I wrote a PhD on Wittgenstein in Scientism.
Okay.
Was the title of my PhD, and I co-edited a book with Ian James Kidd on that after my PhD, and my PhD was an account of the role of Wittgenstein's views on scientism and the role of anti-scientism in his work, and an attempt to kind of put forward Wittgenstein influenced arguments as a critique of scientism. Okay.
Great. And so then what happens for you? Where did you go to next? Because I know that you're sort of in the education space.
Yeah. Well, after my PhD, for a while, I didn't think after a PhD I wanted to go into academia or continue with academia. So I took a break actually from it, and then when I was trying to figure out what to do next, I did the only other thing I knew how to do then professionally, except research and teaching, which was play guitar.
Okay.
And for a few years I was a professional guitarist.
Really?
And that was kind of by accident. When I finished my PhD, I was already doing some paid gigs. I was doing the occasional paid gig throughout my PhD, and then I was like, okay, let's see if I can crank this up a notch to make a small income, not thinking that was possible. And that was actually surprisingly doable. I mean, not like much of an income, It's extremely hard to make much money out of playing guitar, but enough to get by for a
Mate,
few
you
years.
told me at the start you weren't a rock star.
Well, I was definitely a wannabe rock star.
Okay.
I think the name Johnny was used for a while as part of trying to create that identity. So, for a few years, I played a lot of gigs, and I was living in London. I'm still living in London now, but I was living in London then and playing a lot of gigs. And then I was also teaching philosophy for a while in universities, and then actually in schools by accident. I got asked to go and teach philosophy in a school, and I really enjoyed it. And that's what led to me doing educational research. So we're now sort of a couple of years after my PhD, and totally by accident. I never had an intention to go into educational research, but the first school I worked at, they had an educational research centre.
Really?
And I was invited to get involved, particularly on neuroscience and psychology in education. And so when I started doing educational research, so at this point in my life, I'm teaching philosophy, doing educational research, playing guitar, playing lots of gigs, and it was fun. I asked myself, well, what can I contribute to educational research given my background? So one route to go down is philosophy of education, and I've since written various things on philosophy of education and still do now. And I'm actually co-editing a book with Christina Easton, excuse me. Christina Hinton is another good friend of mine. Christina Easton is another good friend of mine. Christina Easton is the lady I'm co-editing this book with. It's called The Future of Education. Yeah. It's coming out from Oxford University Press later this year. And that's on the philosophy of education. But when I started doing educational research, I wanted to find some way I could apply my research on scientism to educational research. So I started looking at ways that scientism might be or is manifested, I would argue anyway, in education. Mm-hmm. And what are the limits to, for example, the science of learning? So I started getting interested in the science of learning, which is super interesting. And that had many benefits to improve my own teaching, looking at ways I could apply the science of learning into my own teaching. And I also started doing some teacher training, so applying it there too. But I started then writing on that. And so I looked at what would be the manifestation of what's called educational neuroscience in a way that would turn it into a form of scientism, which I called educational neuroscientism. So I have a book chapter that's called Educational Neuroscience and Educational Neuroscientism.
Nice.
Where I try to argue what's the distinction between the two and what turns the former into the latter. And I looked at the limits of the science of learning. I have a paper on the limits of the science of learning. And so examples, so I put forward in both of those articles, a definition of what I argue scientism is, some of which we've talked about here. Examples of what would count as scientism in education would be, first,
can I have a guess?
Assumption. Oh yeah, go for it. I'll shut up. Please.
No, it's okay. My wife is a primary school teacher, so I'll have a guess. Is it going to be about learning styles? Is it that like kids can be defined by these 4 or 5 learning styles, and that's
interesting, right? Okay, so that's a great. So I wasn't thinking of that, but we should talk about that because that's fascinating and important. So tell me why you would think that's an example of something.
Because it's like, I could imagine someone coming and doing some like personal development at a school, and they come in and they say, here are some studies, and there's probably even a meta-analysis and a systematic review that says there are these 5 types of learning styles, and one is like, some kids are like visual processors, some kids are whatever, audio, some kids learn by doing, some kids learn by teaching, whatever, I don't know the rest. But I could imagine the way, and I'm sure there is research that suggests that, I have no idea, but you would misapply it in a way with the excessive belief. You would misapply that science by saying every kid will fall into one of these things, one of these categories.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's where my head's at. So, maybe I'm way off.
No, let's go with that. So, that would. Let me just think. Would that be an example of scientism? So that would certainly be something bad, especially given that a lot of research on learning styles has now been debunked.
Okay.
Well, so for a long time, this was like a real buzz theme, learning styles.
Okay.
But now a lot of research on learning styles has been debunked. There is research that suggests that the style in which something is taught and learned, if you kind of complement the kind of subject it is or the kind of thing you're teaching, if, for example, it's a very visual thing, you're teaching like geometry, then that's often best learned visually.
Okay.
Or if you're teaching poetry, that's often best learned through auditory means, because it just helps you access the kind of thing you're studying much better. Now, but there've been many things people teach, or many things that are studied and learned, many things people learn that just don't fall clearly into any kind of sensory way of sensory experience, as it were, a certain type of sense that experiences things. So I've given you a clear example there of kind of vision and auditory learning, and I mean, if you're studying like food technology, obviously taste is going to be really important, and smell as well. But and I suppose with physical education, touch, physically, touching the ball or whatever it is that you're doing. But with various philosophy, I don't know, is philosophy best taught in an auditory way or a visual way or a tactile way? It's not clear.
Okay.
With history, again, I'm not really sure with history either. So there is evidence, though, that certain subjects are best taught in that way, and there's a good book that goes into that. It's called Make It Stick, The Science of Successful Learning, by Brown, Rodiger and McDaniel. But would that be an example of scientism? What I think that would show, tell me what you think of this, if someone identifies themselves on the basis of their learning style, or someone is telling people that they should identify themselves on the basis of their learning style, that, I think, is an example of dangerous dissemination of research.
Maybe I'm confusing those two things.
Well, also it kind of excessive inflation of a piece of research, such that someone extrapolates too much from it to their life as a whole. You could say the same about Myers-Briggs personality types. So some people literally identify their character with their Myers-Briggs personality type, rather be like, hey, I'm ENTP or something, or INTJ, whatever it might be. Now, I've heard from people I deeply respect who know much more about this than me, that your Myers-Briggs character type, like identifying yourself with that, is like getting your palm read at a carnival. So to kind of take that as like, this captures my character in a nutshell, in a 4-letter acronym, is very dangerous. Is that scientism? I'm not sure it's... I mean, I suppose it could be, in the sense that the person interpreting things that way is maybe thinking to themselves, well, not all people would do this, but some might be doing this. They might be saying, science, or psychology rather, as a form of science, it's more like behavioural sciences, has shown us that there are things we can tell about people's characters, and this must be true, so true in fact that I'm going to identify with it. It says a hell of a lot about my character as a whole. Would that be a form of scientism? Yeah, maybe you could say they're placing excessive belief in the power of science there. The problem is, though, that it's just... even if you had quite robust evidence for the reliability of Myers-Briggs personality readings or learning styles, given for someone to identify like their whole learning style with that, the whole way they learn, or their whole personality with either of these things, is a pretty big jump on their behalf, given that science is constantly evolving, as it were. Claims are always open to verification or falsification. So I think that the interpreter in those cases, if they're a well-educated person, should stop for a moment and question this and think, well, that could be part of a wider explanation of things. Yeah. An important part, but not the whole explanation.
Okay, so that was more of a disseminate. Let's put that down maybe as, it could be scientism, but it's more of a dissemination issue, let's say.
Both a dissemination and an interpretation issue.
Okay, yeah, sure.
Yeah. Both of those things.
Nice. I was just blaming the facilitator, but obviously takes two to tango.
I mean, but there'd be some examples of this where it's much more respectable. So, for example, there's very good research in psychology on attachment styles. So let's say someone takes that research and they take attachment style surveys. They take several of them. Let's say they read up on the psychology of attachment and they learn that they are someone who's securely attached or like anxious avoidant or something, and they take that to be reliable. Well, they've got reliable research, and they've read into it, they've read it up on it themselves, and they've taken the surveys and so on. I guess, and there's something that could be learned from that. If someone, say, wanted to become securely attached over time, if they could do that through various practices and therapy, perhaps, and various other things. There's something, you don't want to just not take these things seriously. The point I was making was there you've got loose research that isn't well backed, and someone's drawing a strong conclusion about their entire character or their entire way of learning on the basis of that. If that research is being disseminated responsibility, it's more of a dissemination problem. If that person is, well educated and knows how to interpret research and could read up on this, but is just interpreting this based on some article they read online, then it's more of an interpretation problem.
Yeah, okay.
Sometimes it could be both of those problems.
Cool, thank you. And so I took my guess. My guess was not right. So what was the example that you were going to bring us to?
Oh, okay. So examples of
the
scientism in education. Yep. Yeah. One would be the assumption that scientific methods and findings can just be immediately or straightforwardly applied in educational contexts.
Okay.
Right? So that you could just take some teaching method. Let's look at how this geography teacher is teaching about natural disasters in physical geography, let's say, or even natural disasters in human geography and the implications of them. And let's just and the assumption that you could just apply scientific methods and findings there, let's say about the way the brain works, to just transform the way that teaching is done. Why would that be a form of scientism? Well, first of all, education isn't a branch of science, right? It's an interdisciplinary endeavor involving many areas of study. If you study education at university, you're not studying an isolated subject like biology. It typically involves various strands, maybe a bit of psychology, a bit of sociology, a bit of history, a bit of philosophy, and so on. And so you have to provide clear links between scientific evidence and its application in education, because you don't get a straightforward translation of, we can just apply that to this context of teaching and learning, and bang, we can just improve teaching and learning. I'll give you some more examples if you like. Yeah, no,
that's really valuable. No, sorry, it's really valuable. That's nice. And I think what I heard there was almost like an over-assumption or an overestimation of the generalizability, maybe, of some research findings. Just because it's scientific, it must be true here and here and here. And other examples would be holding that a teacher couldn't be a good teacher, couldn't provide a good education for students without an understanding of the science of learning. Yeah, okay.
Now, you may well become a much better teacher by learning about the science of learning. I think I did, for example, but there's no guarantee someone will. There's many brilliant teachers out there, and there have been many brilliant teachers for millennia. Before there was even any such thing as the science of learning, right? Before there's any such recognizable thing as science as we know it today, so it's not the case that you need to know anything about the science of learning to be a brilliant teacher, or even to have received a brilliant education, right?
Gotcha.
The assumption that you need that, I would argue, to be a form of scientism, because it's just like placing excessive belief in the power or value of the science of learning. So that has two aspects, where you can't be a proficient teacher or you can't provide a good education about science of learning. You can have a brilliant educational institution that doesn't do anything in the science of learning. You could do. I do think education institutions would all be better placed to offer better education if there was attention to the science of learning. How can we improve things on this basis? The point I'm making, though, is that it doesn't have to be the case.
Yeah.
And so it would be scientistic to say, this school or university is rubbish because they're not paying attention to the science of learning.
Gotcha. Yeah, okay, that's great. Thank you. And so we've spent a lot of time talking about scientism. My apologies for that, because I don't know if that's a door that's closed in your life or if it's still an active interest.
I'm not really doing it anymore. No,
Yeah.
This has been cool. I haven't talked about this stuff for yonks.
Okay,
so this has been fun.
I'm glad. So let's talk about what you're up to today. So it'd be really cool to hear sort of some of the projects you're on, because I understand somehow you've gone from sort of future, I mean, not somehow, it's I think pretty clear, future of education, flourishing, well-being is all kind of wrapped up in that in some way. So what are you up to at the moment?
What I'm up to at the moment is, so right now I'm co-editing 2 books. One is on the one I mentioned earlier, on the future of education. That's on the philosophy of education. Its subtitle is Reimagining Its Aims and Responsibilities. So it's on the future aims and responsibilities of education from a philosophical standpoint. Another one is a book like I'm co-editing that we should have finished a long time ago. It's on Wittgenstein and contemporary moral philosophy.
Okay.
So I do still work on this stuff a bit, but where I'm finishing those, where I'm going after this is, one thing I'm doing is I'm trying to apply and synthesize the latest research on human flourishing from, for example, the Human Flourishing Program at Harvard, and from positive psychology and some other areas too, some other movements too, into a coaching model. I'm going to call it Flourish Coaching, and build a coaching approach, build a coaching business where you can legitimately aim to coach people to flourish by applying that research in that area. So that's both a research exercise and a practical exercise, trying to build a coaching organization that does just that. That's something I'm very excited about, that I'm really starting to do more of now. And I'm still deeply involved in studying the role of flourishing in education and trying to help students to flourish as much as possible, but I'm moving more into workplace well-being.
Yep.
How we can understand what it means to thrive at work, and how we can improve workplace well-being and ultimately move towards workplace thriving more, for example, by mitigating the risk of burnout, helping people find more meaning in their work, find more community at work, feel less lonely at work, have better work-life balance, and see the role of work in relation to the rest of their life in a more coherent way, and live in that kind of way. I'm moving into that a lot more as well.
Great. Yeah, I was struck by, I was just at the IPA conference that I was mentioning before.
Oh, awesome.
And I think, I guess I've been pretty critical in the past of IPA, and maybe it was my own assumption, my unrealized assumption that it was, I guess I was coming in expecting it to be a scientific conference. And I guess really it's not, it never promised to be that. That was something that I put on it. It's a association which includes scientists, and lots of them, but it's also about practice as well. And maybe I was looking around and thinking, this, anyway, I guess I'm happy that that's the case, because it's actually a unique strength, I think, of positive psychology, that it is this this very close relationship between the scientists and the practitioners. But it struck me this time around, I think it was like 60% coaches.
Really, at IPA?
Oh,
wow.
It's all coaches, and like the most popular. I mean, it's not all coaches. Maybe it's 30%. I have no idea. Really, I'm making these numbers up. But I was struck by like the most popular sessions were the coaching sessions. The most popular presenters are the coaches.
Wow.
And I think they're all practitioners, to be honest with you. I think some of them would do some research, and maybe they've done research in the background, but I don't see that there are a heap of, and like I could clearly just not know who they are, but it didn't jump out off the page to me who are the coaching researchers, like the most active ones at the moment.
Right.
I'm sure I've just offended a bunch of people, and I apologize to them. Like, this is purely ignorance. But yeah, I mean, I didn't see it. I didn't see it a whole lot.
Yeah.
So it sounds like.
So they were all. Sorry, Karen.
No. I guess it's a big gap. I can see that it's a big gap. Um,
Right. Thank you for sharing that. Wow, that's super interesting. So I take it they were all positive psychology coaches.
Yeah, I don't know, to be honest with you, whether they, I don't know whether they identify as positive psychology people, or whether pos psych is the kind of just the most natural fit. I was really interested. You probably are all across this, but the Masters of Applied Pos Psych course in East London has merged with the coaching masters, if I understand that correctly. It's actually delivered concurrently, or something like that. And I think it sounds like it was a response to this idea that these are seriously overlapping courses, and probably students come with a very shared interest across both of these things.
That's interesting. I mean, I know that like during the pandemic, there was a massive increase in the number of people becoming coaches.
Right.
Worldwide. So, for example, the International Coaching Federation had a massive amount more applications. I don't know the reasons for that, but I can imagine, I would conjecture some of them are that coaching allows you typically to work remotely.
Yeah.
In the pandemic, there was a huge surge in people working remotely, and also thinking, how can I live anywhere in the world and work? So that's one factor. Two, a lot of people are looking for new lines of work, new careers.
Meaningful work, probably.
Yeah, and many people do find it very meaningful, engaging deep with a human being on the coaching level. I can't imagine what the other reasons would be, though. That is very interesting. Thank you for mentioning that there is that gap of people who are working on the research and coaching as well. I mean, there's an excellent book that came out this year called Tomorrow Mind.
Oh yeah,
it's by Gabriella Kellerman, who is the Chief Innovation Officer at Better Up, the biggest coaching organization in the world, and also I think she's founder of Better Up Labs, which is Better Up's research arm. Co-authored with Martin Seligman, the father of positive psychology, as it were, and that's an excellent book on research in positive psychology, application to workplace well-being, and application to coaching. So they'll give like research-backed methods for coaching in there, and of course, I mentioned flourish coaching there. I mean, positive psychology coaching is effectively a form of flourish coaching, with positive psychology being the scientific study of human flourishing, and positive psychology coaching being the attempt to help people flourish using the tools of positive psychology. What I'm trying to do differently is to move beyond just positive psychology and take the latest major, cutting-edge research on human flourishing from positive psychology, but also elsewhere, such as the Human Flourishing Program at Harvard and the Jubilee Center for Character and Virtues, the Blue Zones framework, and other research too. Synthesize that into a coaching approach.
Cool. And you mentioned that the International Association of Coaching, I didn't catch exactly what it's called, but
ICF, the International Coaching Federation.
There you go. Sounds like a wrestling association or something, but federation just makes me think about wrestling.
Yeah, absolutely.
How overlapping with positive psychology are they? Is that something you know?
Well, I mean, I'm not exactly sure, but they don't. No, the ICF are not attached to positive psychology coaching. And positive psychology coaching is one approach to coaching of many, and I'm pretty sure the ICF stay neutral as to which. The world's biggest coaching organization. I'm pretty sure they stay neutral as to which particular approach to coaching they follow, which as they should. They have, I believe, preferred coaching methods, and they have a definition of coaching, and so on, but they don't, they're not following any one coaching approach.
All right, cool. And so, you've got your work cut out for you by the sounds of it. Flourish coaching, thriving at work.
Yeah, well, it's exciting though. I mean, it's one thing I love doing is not only doing research on human well-being and flourishing, but then trying to apply that in the real world to help people live better lives. That's one thing I love about having moved from doing research in philosophy and teaching philosophy. I love doing those things, but now doing research where it actually has a clear practical application, and always does. And I think that's perhaps one of the reasons I've really enjoyed going into well-being research from philosophy. I still do a lot of philosophy in that, but it having a direct practical output rather than, as much as I love chatting about scientism, it's not clear that we're gonna do a great
Shift
deal
the dial,
in our
yeah.
day-to-day lives off the back of that. We could find practical applications of it, but it's not immediately evident that we will.
Yeah. Okay. Fantastic. And
You're not going to go and see your Scientism coach at the weekend.
yeah, I can't imagine that being the case. You'd probably spend half the time talking, as we have, about what actually is scientism and what's just something else. All right, fantastic. Well, I'm really conscious of your time. I know that it's late at night over there, so
It's all right. I can chat for about 6 more minutes if you want to keep chatting a bit longer.
Yeah, well,
but if you want to wrap, it's
no,
fine.
no, 6 minutes would be fantastic. So, I guess my last question is kind of like what's exciting you most? You mentioned some pretty big fields like the coach versus the work stuff.
Yeah.
What do you think you can
What's
do?
exciting me most right now? Yeah. Okay. What 3 things are exciting me most right now? The first is maybe 4 things actually. The first is trying to develop this flourish coaching model.
Yeah.
How can we take the latest research on human flourishing, synthesize that into a well-backed and accessible and usable and practical method through which you can coach people and actually have real benefits for them. So, for example, how can you help people find more meaning in their life or in their work or in their personal life or all of those areas through coaching and through a greater education in human flourishing? How can you help people experience lower levels of loneliness? How can you help people reduce their risk of burnout? How can you help people find more life satisfaction, fulfill their potential more, develop their character, feel more happiness and life satisfaction and so on through coaching? Of course, and many forms of coaching tries to do these things, but what's the most powerful way we can possibly do that? That's one thing I'm very excited about doing. And the second is that I have for some time on and off been trying to write a book for a general audience on human flourishing.
Okay.
And it's a big project, and I moved away from it for a while because I thought maybe this is like a career-long project. It's the kind of thing you do at the end of your life after writing books and other things like more narrow themes.
Yep.
And for a while I was, moving away from it, but I'm more motivated to get back into that now actually and try and do that, to write a book for a general audience on flourishing. I have been advised to title it "How to Flourish," but I'm not sure. Maybe that'll be the title. Who knows? The third is I continue to be very excited about our podcast, the podcast I run with Nick Holton, called Flourish FM. That's a source of great fun and joy and intellectual stimulation for me. It's great running it with Nick. We have great guests. We're very lucky to have great guests and get to learn all about their fascinating work. And I love doing that. So I continue to be excited about that. Is that everything I'm excited about right now? I think that probably
some pretty
is
big stuff there.
In the academic world, that in the professional sphere, those are the things I'm most excited about.
Yeah, and is there one personal thing you'd like to share? Now we've gone professional.
What am I most excited about personally right now? Well, I did. So I went to Portugal recently, and I started learning to surf. I bet you're a master surfer.
No,
Are you really good at surfing?
No. I live like our we don't have like big waves where I live because we've got like an island that kind of shelters us from the big waves.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So,
Unfortunately, I love the beach, but can't surf.
Yeah, we talked about. I really envy that you live near the beach. It's one of the things that sucks about London. We do oddly have a beach on the Thames. This little body of sand.
I can imagine. Yeah,
it's not. You just laugh at it if you thought that. If you ever saw that, and you could call that a beach. No, to be fair, no one calls it a beach. But I've been. I think actually I've been trying to find ever since stopping playing guitar. I don't really play anymore. A flow experience that matches getting up on stage and playing, especially like jamming out funk or jazz or something like that. And I'd heard that surfing was this amazing flow experience. So I'm not there yet because I'm just rubbish at it. But I'd like to get more into that. And you can do it in the UK, in Cornwall and so on. But Portugal's easy to get to.
Sure.
A short flight. So I want to do more of that. And I love adrenaline-fueled activities. So I'm trying to just do more mountain biking. There's a bungee jump I really want to do on the Swiss-Italian border, but that's not really a regular activity.
Sure.
So I'm excited personally about more adrenaline fueled hobbies,
Okay.
I guess.
I like it. Got to
What are you most excited about right now, Matt?
It's going to be a work thing, if that can be so lame as to say
Go
a work
for it,
thing.
man. Well, I gave you 3 work things.
Yeah,
so
okay. No, it's this we've got like a series of studies that we're sort of embarking down to get towards this taxonomy of well-being.
wow.
Because we come across we're very applied in the research that we do, and we just struggle every day with this issue of what do you mean by well-being? And the truth is,
Right.
we can't really answer that because no one really agrees, right? As you would understand. And so we're going down a couple of series of studies, hopefully culminating in a bit of a Delphi study of, we're going to do some groundwork to inform this Delphi, but a Delphi hopefully of like a multidisciplinary Delphi. So it's going to be pretty big, hopefully. Everyone who has a bit of a claim to well-being, so like from economics through to philosophy, clinical, pos-psych, health, medicine, whatever it might be. And I don't expect that we'll reach consensus, but that will kind of be the point. There'll be some things that we all agree on, and some things that we don't. So that's kind of that's what I'm all about basically at the moment.
Love that. Well, please keep me posted on that.
Yeah.
That sounds awesome.
No, fantastic.
And I really want to see what research you guys pull out. That'd be amazing.
Yeah, no, thank you. And listen, so thank you so much for your time. This has been a real joy.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll continue to enjoy the podcast, and I'll keep tracking your the books and publications that come out too.
Thanks so much,
No
Matt.
worries.
And yeah, great podcast. Thank you.
Thank
for
you, mate.
inviting me on
And
this.
look
It's
out
been
for
great.
yourself on the extreme sports. Like you need to survive, man. You got some good work to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, how can you flourish without bungee jumping?
Yeah, that's true. All right, very cool. Thank you, mate.